Welcome, everybody. Welcome here in Wageningen, welcome in Washington, D.C., and welcome everybody joining us in any city, country, or continent around the world at the launch of today's Urban Greenhouse Challenge. It's the third edition, and during this kickoff event, we will officially launch this challenge, but we will also be discussing how urban agriculture can function in more ways than just food production, as important as that is as well. It is always my aim to spark new connections between all of you, and spark something within you. That's what I do in my day-to-day job, but also today, as your host of today. So I'm happy to be here with you. My name is Simone Ritzer. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to spark something, hopefully, within you. But we're going to do that by interviewing, by talking with some very inspiring people who are here with us today. They're going to share their insights. They're hoping to enlighten you, to share some of their ideas on the future of urban farming, of urban agriculture, urban greenhouses, to you from wherever you're joining us around the world. I'm not going to do that on my own. I have tons of questions for them, but I'm not participating in this challenge. That's what you are going to do, joining us online, and most of the people joining us here in Wageningen. So it's up to you to ask the questions that you want to ask them. As long as you think that I dare to ask them to our speakers, don't hesitate to share them with us. You're probably wondering now, how to share these questions? Well, that is something that my colleague, my co-host of today, is going to share with you. So a warm welcome to Maud Vegeling.
Hi everyone, and thank you for the applause here in the audio. So, as Simone already told you, I am Maud, I'm the co-host of today, and I will make sure that all the questions that you have, that they will be answered by the speakers of today. So, how can you do this? So, for both the people joining us from online as well as everyone here in the studio, you can go to the website wur.joinlive.tv, which is in the screen right now. So again, wur.joinlive.tv. And here you can put all your questions down in the chat. Then I will make sure that they will be answered. Besides the chat that we have for your questions, we also have some polls for you today. So throughout the event, sometimes there will be a poll popping up in your screen, and it would be very nice if you could answer them, so to give us a bit of more feel who's actually joining the event today. So just a small poll to test if everyone understands how it works. So we are actually very interested where you're all watching from. So of course, we have some people in the studio here, but I assume that since the Urban Greenhouse Challenge is so international, we have a worldwide audience today. So let's see, I see a lot of North America, a lot of Europe. Do we have some people from Asia or Africa watching? I don't think so for now, but maybe later. I hope that everyone understands how the poll works. Then some last thing, you see this nice little bell I have here. So if you hear that sound, it will be that someone put a very interesting questions down in the chat box, and I will make sure that they will be questioned to one of their speakers immediately. So just don't hesitate to put your questions down, and let's hope for a very interesting event today.
Well, thank you very much, Maud, for sharing all this. I will come back to you throughout this program. And once again, this is all about you today. This whole show is about you. So place your questions there. But maybe first it's time to sit back and relax and listen a little bit to one of our speakers that we have here with us. Joining us all the way from Washington, D.C. is with us online Dr. Sabine O'Hara. Sabine, are you here with us and can you hear us?
I can hear you loud and clear. Good morning for me, good afternoon for you.
Thank you very much, Sabine. Well, let me introduce you first to our audience who wasn't able to see you yet, but will be in a second. because Sabine is a teacher, a mentor, a researcher, and a administrator who always functions her work around inspiring and improving the lives of the underserved communities. She currently leads an innovative PhD program at the University of the District of Columbia about urban leadership and entrepreneurship. But prior to that position, she also found, as a dean, this College of Agriculture on Urban Sustainability and Environmental Sciences, which abbreviates as CAUSES. And when I heard that, I was immediately triggered because I think that that is exactly what Sabine always does. She really serves a good cause. So Sabine, we have you here joining us online to really talk about these local communities and how to serve them. I'm very much looking forward to listen to you. Once again, for the audience, it's just time to sit back and relax, get inspired, but don't relax too much because, as Maud introduced, it's up to you to ask your questions via the platform that we shared with you previously. And we will come back to these questions later. But first, Sabine, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you for this great introduction. It's wonderful to be with you and to see this challenge moving into its phase for which we all have prepared, namely we now have teams who are actually going to be engaged in the challenge. And so it's a great moment, and I was looking forward to this for many months. And thank you for your generous introduction, Simone. I thought I should give you maybe an overview of urban agriculture and its role, particularly in Washington, D.C., but more broadly in the United States. And so I prepared some slides for you to help our train of thought, and hopefully the slides will also trigger some ideas for you and questions that you might want to ask. And I can only see half of my slides on the screen, but I hope you can see them. So if we can get a different, there you go. Now we've got a great screen picture. So food is awesome, don't you agree? Because I am what we call in the United States a foodie. That means a person who is absolutely loves food in every way. And so food is really important because it fuels our bodies, but it also keeps us healthy, not just in body, but in mind, because we know how important food is also for our mental agility. When we have too much sugar, we get hyper. When we have too much fat and salt, we get sluggish. So it's really important, but it also fuels our economy. We may think of food only as farming, but think again. Food connects us to a whole host of different sectors in the economy. Restaurants, then the whole food processing, the hospitality industry, tourism, so much more. It connects us to nature and to nature's ecosystems. And it can be a source of energy and of soil health. So when you think of composting, for example, or biodigesting food waste, so a lot of awesome qualities that food has, but food can also be pretty bad. In the United States, actually what we call people food, you know, plants that are vegetables and fruits are actually mostly imported. So they require a lot of transportation. Our food system here in the United States is highly centralized, and in many highly developed countries, that is the case. It's more industry than what we have traditionally thought of as farming. And that means it travels very, very long distances. And what we've learned, particularly during these last 18 months that we have as a global community struggled with the COVID pandemic, we've learned how vulnerable these supply chains are and how difficult it is to get things to where they need to be. And with food, that is especially difficult because it's a perishable product. It's also very unevenly distributed. We have what we call here in the United States food apartheid neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods where there is no access to unprocessed fresh food and where grocery stores are simply not there. And then we have areas where there is food available in abundance. Food can make us sick. It can cause obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and so forth. It also employs some of the lowest paid workers in many of our countries around the world, food workers, not only in farming, but in the food sector as a whole, are very low paid and often have very dangerous working conditions. And it has huge negative externalities. So I'm an agricultural economist, so let me unpack for you a little bit what these externalities means. It's economic jargon for effects that aren't happening where they are created, but they travel. So externalities are not captured in the prices and in the markets of our economic systems, but they are displaced over time and over space. And so here are some examples of negative externalities of food. 11% of the US greenhouse gas emissions come from food transportation, because as I told you, it's not produced where most of the consumers live, but it's very centralized in a few places. And then from there, it needs to travel. As a global community, it's even worse. 25% of CO2 emissions stem from food transportation. Food production uses 70% of the global freshwater use. That's a huge number. And the sad thing is that only 70% roughly of that food that we produce with all these resources is actually used as food. 30% goes to food waste. And that's a huge number. Food also infringes on ecosystems. It deteriorates groundwater. It can use eutrophication of surface water. It can impact soil health negatively, cause erosion because of practices that are not conducive to supporting ecosystem services. And in the US agriculture, as I said, we have very high vulnerable food supply chains because it travels so much. So that's often how we think about negative externalities, but I want to introduce to you another concept of negative externalities, and these are social externalities. So because food is so inaccessible in some places, we have food insecurity. That means that people can't get enough food or not enough of the right food. And so in DC, in the United States capital, we have a big problem with food insecurity. 13% of DC households say they are food insecure. Almost 20% experience food hardship, meaning they can't get enough food or not the right food at least sometime during the year. And here's what to me is one of the most shocking numbers, namely 37% of DC households with children were unable to afford enough food in the past year. There are also a lot of food-related illnesses, particularly in those neighborhoods where food is not readily accessible, or the right food, unprocessed food, healthy food isn't readily accessible. And when you look at the shock that we've just experienced in COVID with the COVID pandemic, we know that food-related illnesses like diabetes, hypertension, obesity actually then constitute a pre-existing health condition that makes people more vulnerable for other shocks like COVID. Now, on top of that, we have another big social challenge, namely by 2040, roughly, we will have to feed 9 billion people. So we're expecting further population growth. And so all these challenges of food are going to be exacerbated. So here's what the negative externalities then actually look in real life. What you see on this graph, the yellow bars are obesity of people over 18, adult population, and the red bars are diabetes. So as you would expect, obesity is higher than diabetes, but look at the distribution. The 8 wards That's how the District of Columbia, the capital of the United States, is administratively organized. It's organized into 8 wards. And so Ward 8 has very high obesity and diabetes rate, as does Ward 7. And look at Ward 3 and Ward 2, much, much lower rates of obesity and diabetes. Here is maybe one of the causes, right? Because this is fast food versus coffee shops. Now, Ward 2 is an outlier. That's where most of our tourists go in Georgetown. But look, there's no coffee shops in Ward 7 and 1 in Ward 8, but there's fast food. And so what food is accessible to people really makes a big difference in terms of their physical health and their mental health. This is violent crime. And again, look at the distribution. Ward 3, very, very low. Ward 7 and Ward 8, very, very high rates of violent crime. Food supply chains, that's a big issue underlying. And again, particularly a problem in what we call underserved neighborhoods, food apartheid neighborhoods, because look how short that supply chain is when you grow at least some of your own food and it goes from your home to your garden, or farmers markets where the food is distributed in a market that's accessible in your neighborhood, relatively short supply chain. And that typical one is when we have supermarkets and the food travels from the farm to a distribution center and to their store. What we did just now during COVID is we added to that supply chain. It became longer because now those of us who can afford it, we want that food on our doorstep so we don't have to go to the store. And so we've just added distribution steps that make that supply chain even longer and even more vulnerable. So as I said, these negative externalities are not evenly distributed. And you remember those very short bars in Ward 3 and those very high bars in Ward 7 and Ward 8? Well, here's some background that you should be aware of. Ward 3 is the highest income ward in Washington, D.C., and Ward 8 is the lowest income ward. Ward 3 has very low unemployment with 3.7%, and Ward 8 has 22% unemployment. Ward 7 has 19% unemployment. Female-headed household, those are single-parent household. Remember, 37% of children who have food insecurity. Well, there you have it. In Ward 7 and 8 is the highest percentage of households that are headed by a single parent, and that parent is usually female, as opposed to very low percentages in some of the other wards. And here it is. In Ward 3, where things look pretty good, only 6% of the population are non-Hispanic Black. This is a designation of the United States Census. We don't say African Americans in the census. We say Black people who are not Hispanic, who designate that they're not Caribbean or, of dark-skinned Hispanic descent, but they are Black and either African immigrant or African American population, versus in Ward 7 and 8, where you saw those very high bars of food-related illnesses and violent crime. There you have it. 95% or 94% are dark-skinned people, what we call in the census non-Hispanic Black populations. So there's all kinds of reasons why this distribution is so, and it doesn't just happen, but there are policy decisions behind it. And so what's the problem? Well, the problem is how we value things. And when it comes to our food economy, people and nature are really valued as inputs. So they're reduced to their function on how do they contribute to the production of goods and services. And oops, then we have emissions and waste as a side product. Well, we've thought about this long and hard over the last 20, 30 years as a world community, haven't we? And we said this valuation concept of everything is an input, that's really not very cool. And it creates a lot of problems. It creates a lot of negative externalities. So let's do this a little bit better. And let's recognize that in order for us to be sustainable, we need to pursue economic goals and value those goals. We need to pursue social goals and value those goals, and environmental goals. And we called it the 3 Ps, meaning we need to consider not just profits, but also people and the planet. And then we say, well, ideally we would operate at this intersection of the Venn diagram right here, where the 3 circles overlap. And that's what we call sustainability. But I would submit to you that really what we need to think about is we need to really recognize that these systems of people, planet, and profits are not equal. But instead, what we have here is we need to think about value differently in a different hierarchy. Namely, the economy is this little subsystem that's embedded in what we call society and its cultures. And we as human people who have societies, who have cultures that operate differently, but we're embedded in the environment. And that environment ultimately is that one globe that we all share, that one planet that we all share. And so why don't we think about systems very differently? When we think about the environment as something that we can control, we completely overlook that there is much more than inputs. It's not just about the sources, but the environment also absorbs our sinks. Oceans absorb CO2. They absorb our emissions. The soil absorbs carbon, and it processes our emissions. Water filters through the soil, and emissions are taken up by the soil. Plants absorb CO2 and they release oxygen. If they didn't do that, we wouldn't be here, because we're dependent on that oxygen to breathe as human beings. So the environment teaches us to think much more in circular systems. It's not just about the resources, it's also where does the stuff go that we leave behind? And how do these systems function that are fabulous sinks that take up some of that emission and waste? And I have news for you. Our bodies are sinks too. Our bodies absorb emissions and they absorb stress. So when the economy becomes too large and takes up too much of our time, we get stressed out. And then our families also have to absorb that stress. And if I'm exhausted and I become sick, well, who has to absorb that problem? Our communities absorb those kinds of stresses when we have elevated rates of stress and illness resulting from that. So why then don't we think about our food much more in cyclical systems like nature? So it's about producing food, processing food, distributing the food, and then can we do that in a way that we close the loop so we use very little water, and whatever water we use and whatever waste we generate, can we recover it and reuse it again? That would be an ideal, or at least a much better food system than this kind of linear system has. So producing food in urban neighborhoods may not happen in soil, but it may require aquaponic and hydroponic systems where we grow in nutrient-rich water. Maybe can we grow food on walls, on roofs, and processing? Let's add value so that people better understand how to use their food in a way that is nutritious and good for their bodies, but that's also safe. So there are a lot of sanitation issues that we need to consider, especially in urban environments where soil health might be an issue and waste processing might be an issue. How can we distribute food differently? Does it just have to be grocery stores, or can we think about markets, food trucks, direct deliveries to ethnic restaurants that maybe cater to our different cultural tastes? Community-supported agriculture stands for weekly deliveries of food. Oh, we have one innovative one here in DC. We call it actually veggie prescriptions, where medical professionals now prescribe vegetables rather than medication. So these are all different ways to think about food distribution. And can we think about it in a more equitable way? And then, of course, this closing the loop idea, there are lots of activities that go into that. Composting, generating energy from food waste, collecting rainwater, using that for irrigation, irrigating just the roots, rather than sprinkling from the top when a lot of that water then evaporates. And in the urban context, maybe agriculture can become our best friend, because when we increase permeable surfaces and introduce plants that absorb water and heat, that also helps the urban environment and makes the urban environment healthier. So this is what we've implemented in Washington, D.C. in 4 locations, this idea of the urban food hub that consists of these 4 components of food production, food processing, food distribution, and closing the loop through proper waste and water management. And here you see them. These 4 squares are the urban food hubs, and those purple dots are actually grocery stores. And look at the bottom half of that diamond-shaped space here. That is the map of Washington, D.C. You'll see Ward 7 and 8 at the bottom right corner, and how few grocery stores are located in that neighborhood where you saw all these food-related illnesses and these social externalities. And one of those urban food hubs in our Ward 7 site, which is one of our larger sites, it's also very nicely accessible because it happens to be located right across the street from one of our metro stations. That's our East Capitol Urban Farm, because it's located at the intersection of East Capitol Street and Southern Avenue in Ward 7, which is the 2nd lowest income ward with actually the highest percentage of school-aged children in Washington, D.C. And that is the location of this year's Urban Greenhouse Challenge. So I am thrilled that you all will be spending a lot of time helping us to think through how we can make our food system circular and restorative, so that it improves public health rather than making people sick, so that it alleviates disparities, so everybody who needs access to fresh food will have that access, so that we produce at least some of our food where most consumers live, namely in cities. And in the United States, that percentage of people who live in cities is almost 80% of the population. Can we think about our food that is offered in low investment alternatives, especially in neighborhoods where income is a problem and incomes are low? So can we think of ways of rethinking our food system so it doesn't cost a ton of money for people to start producing food in their own neighborhoods? Can we lower the energy footprint of food so it becomes more affordable and reduces water and waste, restores ecosystem services rather than destroying them? And last but not least, can we think of a food system that is very intentional about reconnecting people to nature? So thank you all for your attention. And I'm going to end by sharing just some pictures from some of our urban food hubs. And I look forward to your questions and to sharing more information with you over these next few weeks about our Ward 7 site for this Global Greenhouse Challenge. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sabine, for this great introduction and for really enlightening us a bit more about what's really happening there in this Ward 7 of Washington, D.C. People, of course, the students are going to look at the different local communities around the world, but focusing on this Ward 7 community. And as you said, you really gave us some insights in really what's happening. But for everybody here in the room and everybody joining us online, this is your chance to ask more questions on what is it to focus on, how to really dive into the topic, because it's not just up to you to answer all these big questions and to rethink the system. You can learn from everybody who's already working on it, like Sabine. So don't hesitate to ask your questions. Going to the link that was just in the screen, were.joinlive.tv, and you will get the chance to ask your questions to Sabine. But Sabine, we already have quite some questions for you. I was triggered by a lot of the data that you were sharing with us. 37% of the households with children that are not able to buy affordable and healthy food all the time. Um, when looking into that data, what would you recommend students to look into? What type of data before they start really developing all these, new initiatives?
Yeah, certainly, some of my own work is available to the students. I created a report a few years ago called The 5 Pillars of Economic Development, and that captures a lot of the data. If you want to see the sources where that data came from, a lot of that came from the United States Census. There's also and you'd have to, when you look at the census, it can be a bit overwhelming. This is a lot of data. The United States is a very large country. So then you need to really focus down on the region that you're looking for. So this would be Washington, D.C. And within Washington, D.C., then you have to find the census tract that makes up Ward 7, where the urban farm is located. And so that's a really good source. There's also a health disparities report that was published by the Washington, D.C. Department of Health. And it also analyzes the data of food-related illnesses by ward. So that can be a really interesting source. There's also a really interesting report that came out of, on a number of reports actually, that came out of the DC Department of Energy and the Environment. And that is actually called Sustainable DC. It's an effort of our municipality, and we're a city-state in Washington, D.C., so it's sort of a municipality, but it's also a little bit of a state government. And so there are a lot of really useful reports that spell out the vision of DC as a green, sustainable, and just city that addresses some of these inequities that you've seen in the data. And so those would be great sources. The Sustainable DC report, the Health Disparities report, and the United States Census data.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And well, you can really look into the data, but when you started, you said food is great, and for me, food is also culture. So, can you
Yeah.
take us along a little bit on that the cultural aspect of the people living there?
Yes, so as you saw in the data, this is a neighborhood, 94% what we call non-Hispanic Black. So again, this is African American, but could also be African populations that are captured in that percentage. So this is a very high percentage of people who come from the African origin. And a growing population is Hispanic populations. And
But what
so
does it
you're
say?
absolutely right.
What does it say about the
Hispanic,
people? How is it? Because this says something about, well, their color, and that also has a cultural aspect to it. So how do
absolutely.
they live together?
Different food culture, right? And because out of necessity, a lot of the dishes that you find in the African American tradition, because oftentimes they were people who were deprived of access to a lot of resources. And so a lot of those dishes are really, um, you know, stewed vegetables, greens that are very affordable. a lot of times what we would call some of the leftovers of the meat, right? The pig's feet rather than the fillet. So a lot of those dishes are also quite spicy. West Africa is known for a very spicy cuisine. So it's a really interesting food culture. And then, of course, you have some of the Caribbean influences as well. Hot peppers. Some people have a strong tradition of pickling their food. What is really interesting about Washington, D.C., there was a time before the grocery stores, the large grocery store chains moved in Washington, D.C., where Washington had what was called the Washington Grocery Cooperatives, D.C. Grocery Cooperatives. And that was an umbrella organization that supported small cooperative food ventures. These were small mom and pop type stores in these neighborhoods that really catered to the taste, to the ethnic and cultural tastes of these neighborhoods where these small stores were located. And then we also had hucksters. Hucksters were food carts where these small vendors would bring food into the neighborhood. You could come out on Thursday night, he's ringing his bell, you'd come out of your front door and can buy your food there. And these hucksters too catered to a specific taste of the neighborhoods they served. And so this was a rich cluster of small food venues that met the food supplies of these neighborhoods that are very much shaped by their own distinct food cultures. And then in the 1970s, the grocery cooperative disbanded because it could no longer exist against the pressure of these very large grocery chains. And sure enough, as soon as the hucksters and the small stores were pushed out, the grocery chains moved to the suburbs and to those wards where the income is higher, and left us with what we call these food apartheid neighborhoods. And that's why they are food apartheid, because they were the result of decisions that were made. They didn't just grow naturally like a desert environment. And that's why we prefer that term food apartheid to the term food deserts, because a desert environment is a natural ecosystem and it can actually be very beautiful. So anyways,
Okay.
but this is an interesting history of the food and culture connection in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, thank you for sharing about that cultural aspect also to it, because indeed food is culture and it really depends on also the people that are going to eat your food. It's not just about the production side of it, it's also about the whole culture of eating it altogether. Um, Maybe a good question to start rounding off also. You said somewhere in your keynote about rethinking the system. Be bold. What are you really challenging these student teams to?
Yeah, a lot of times when we only rely on, and this is why I wanted to try and make this point about rethinking how we assign value. So if we depend only on markets as the only institution that we depend on to come up with our food prices and to account for the food costs, then we're missing a whole host of things that are not captured in markets and prices. And I would really hope that the students could look at that and say, how can we bring that in? How can we bring these impacts in? How can we turn these negative externalities into positives? Or at least if we can't turn them into positive, then let's at least be honest that there is more happening than what can be captured in food prices. And there are costs that other people bear in places that are not located right where the food is produced, maybe, but these externalities travel over time to future generations and over longer distances. And so can we rethink how we value things? And maybe what we should do is account for the real cost of food, including those externalities, rather than always trying to get cheap food. And if that means that food then has a different cost structure, then we can discuss how can we make it more equitable and how can we make sure that people who have less money can still get healthy food. But maybe relying on food prices alone that are communicated through markets, maybe that's not enough. And so let's try and bring the whole picture of the food system in as we look at this. Now, I understand this is a big challenge, okay? Because if we knew how to do this, we would have already done it. So,
but thank you
but I
very much.
wanted to at least raise it as an issue for these fabulous student teams so we can tap into their ingenuity and creativity to help us in this conversation about how do we really change our value system so it is more adequately capturing the real impacts of what we do in our economy.
Thank you very much, Sabine. And it also has to do with not just measuring maybe the true cost of current food production, but also the true benefits of maybe new systems that we're developing. So that is something that you can all take up
Absolutely.
in your challenge or in the solutions that you're coming with. Thank you very much for all your words. Sabine O'Hara joining us from Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
Well, and that was Sabine joining us, and there were questions. I have so many questions, but again, it's here. They are here for you. We have two more guests coming up, but before I'm going to introduce them to you, I'm heading over to Maud again, so you can practice a little bit with that polling option. So, Maud, what do you have in store for us?
Yes, thank you very much. Just to look back first on the talk of Sabine, thank you so much for your questions. Some of them are really interesting, and I'm going to ask them to the speakers that we have coming up next. So please just don't hesitate to put the rest of your questions in the chat. For now, we have an interesting poll for you, because we're very interested in what our audience thinks. So I think the poll is already in your screen right now. So for the audience here, where do you actually get your daily food from? So Sabine told us a little bit about Ward 7 and Ward 8, and sort of like the lack of supermarkets in the wards there. In the Netherlands, I think it's a little bit different, luckily for us at least. So I see some, yeah. So for now, supermarket is 100% score. So that already gives a little bit of a taste how maybe our environment is a little bit different than Ward 7. Anyone else? Everyone is going for the supermarket. Well, perhaps in the future in the supermarket there will be products from an urban farm. You don't know. So thank you very much for that question. I suggest for now that we can go back to Simone and to the two speakers that we have today. And then I'll answer some of your questions later on.
Thank you very much, Maud, for sharing that. Indeed, because this is just the current situation, but what about the future situation? We're going to talk about that possible future situation together here with Dr. Sigrid Wertheim-Heck and Tiffany Tsui. Welcome to both of you. We're going to discuss how urban agriculture can affect the local economy, the culture, the communities, but also the more technological aspects of urban agriculture. So good to have all different kind of perspectives here at the table with you. First of all, welcome Sigrid. You're a researcher in consumption sociology with the main focus on food security. We just saw in Ward 7 that's not the case with 37% of the households, with children not being food secure. Sigrid is a professor, associate professor here in Wageningen, and a professor in food and healthy living at the ERES Hogeschool, the Applied Science University here in the Netherlands. And I do realize that we're not such a diverse collective, let's say, here when it comes to gender, because I have another power woman here with me. I'm happy to introduce Tiffany Tsui. Tiffany is a global strategist and really a pioneer when it comes to global development, green buildings, and eco cities. And your main focus is on China, but you are a woman of the world, speaking different languages as well. But we're sticking with English now. Currently, you're a managing partner at the Vertical Farm Institute, and your focus is really on this next green revolution. Well, I got to know the green revolution from back in the days of Norman Borlaug, but this is the new green revolution focusing on greening buildings for climate resilience and producing food in a sustainable way in our cities. Once again, I have tons of questions to be asked to these inspiring ladies, but it's also up to you to ask your questions. Just to start with, maybe, it's about, I just said it to Sabine also, food is culture also. To start with you, Sigrid, what does food mean to you?
Now let's start this. I'm another human being, let us everyone here around us and everyone watching. And we all consume food. And I think that especially in our pandemic situation, we have become very much aware about the role of food in our lives because of taking care of yourself, your own health, like also Sabine already indicated. But also we have many people, not all, had some more time at their disposal. They started to cook and all on Facebook and all these type of social media channels. People were actually competing on who can cook the best dishes or experimenting with food. Also, kind of being localized, embedded, having a reconnection with a local production site. People had more time also to be more interested in the ways how to source food beside only the supermarket that we just saw on the poll. So you saw also that new alternatives of accessing food for households shaped up. So, and then besides that, we also saw that food gave a kind of rhythm. Most people had to stay home or work from home. So what provides rhythm in your family life is sit together at a table in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, but also celebrating kind of leisure moments. If you can't go out, how do you do it? It's with food and drinks. So food serves so many different aspects of our everyday lives that it should be silly to only look at food from kind of nourishment. And of course, from a sustainability perspective, a lot is looked at how can we consume healthy and sustainable food. But therein also we should include the question, and how can then food still serve so many other aspects of our daily life, of our cultures, of our well-being, of our family lives, of our celebrations. So food is definitely a very big part of our everyday lives.
Yeah. And for you, Tiffany, you really are a global citizen, I could say. Is there a difference in what food means and what place it takes in our daily lives between the different countries that you're navigating through?
Well, I'm Chinese, so that already says a lot of what people consider food. In China is known for food being part of everything. Food is the culture. So no business can be done without the proper food. So there you do see also a big difference versus, for example, the Dutch culture. Here, food is placed in much less significance. But for many cultures like China or in other more traditional cultures, food is really important in connecting family, in connecting to your root and ancestry, the enjoyment, the community, but also very important for government, for business. It's really the media where you can actually with communication.
Nice. Maybe a nice assignment for the people at home to do, or for the students as a team to, I would challenge you to this. I had once this assignment where we were asked to draw lunch. How does it look like having lunch? And I was just drawing my sandwich with a piece of cheese on it and some hagelslag, which is chocolate sprinkles. And that was my lunch, drawing it. And someone else was drawing a big table with people around it. Yeah. So it's a completely different interpretation of what lunch or food means to you. So nice one. When talking about food, what are you actually talking about? Then maybe also, Sigrid, for you, when we're talking about urban communities, is there a difference? Is there something specifically we can say about the sociology, let's say, of urban cultures, of urbanized areas when it comes to food?
Definitely about urban areas. I wouldn't say just only about urban culture, because also it's a bit blurring boundaries, and also but urban areas around the world are expanding. And most of the urban areas are also in fertile lands, in the deltas, for instance. And so they take up a lot of fertile soil that is being just covered by concrete build-up environment, and therewith also the distance from consumption to production increases. We see that not so directly in the Netherlands, because if we consider the Netherlands, we have, as one city, we have nicely integrated these green areas in our urban hubs. But for instance, if you take Lagos in Nigeria, or if you take Beijing, or if you even take Moscow or Hanoi, or then you see actually these large wide circles of built-up environment, and somewhere on the outskirts there's some food production. And there also you see actually how rapidly people forget about food cultivation and production, where it comes from. I lived for 9 years in Vietnam, and actually when I arrived there, people knew everything from food production. And in the area where I lived, there was food production all around me. When I left, still living in the same street, there was no food production there anymore. But also I noticed in my research that many people didn't know about food production anymore. So you also see how rapidly knowledge about food and food production actually diminishes, not even over generations, but actually almost within half a generation. And that is, of course, yeah, that is striking. So in that sense, the aspect of an urban kind of food culture could be considered. But on the other hand, there's another big trend, and that is that populations within these urban areas that are expanding are also becoming increasingly diverse. And that can be diverse because, for instance, in the Netherlands, we have that's called the majority cities in terms of ethnicities. We have many ethnicities in cities like Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I think there are over 160 different ethnicities there. So there are multiple cultures within a city, and that creates also new dynamics of intercultural food cultures again. But all these different aspects in urban settings make that food consumption is constantly changing. So the demands of populations are constantly changing, but also the relation with production is constantly changing. And at this moment, we really have to reconsider it, not only because people lose connection to the production, but also simply because of logistics aspects. If you have to get all the food into the city, and especially with perishable products on a daily basis, then you run into huge logistic problems as well. Yeah. So acculturation together with expanding cities, logistics problems also all demand, and there are many other aspects as well, to reconsider food in urban areas. And you can't just talk about an urban food culture at all. Yeah.
This is so really look at an integrated system with all these of this whole area.
Yes.
But you did mention, you said in Vietnam within 9 years it kind of the whole system changed. You can see that as a negative thing, but I imagine, hey, if something can shift within 9 years toward one side, can we also flip it back or change the system in another way? In, let's say, 9 years' time, or maybe less, because we don't have that much time maybe when looking at the data that Sabine was sharing. So there is also maybe a positive aspect to that. But when the students are going into really this urban area, let's say, and they try to identify the cultural aspects that are really inherited to their food culture, what would you recommend them to look at, to focus on, to be aware of when looking into these different cultures?
Yeah, I think really look at people, talk with people, and be curious. I think that's the most important part. And I think I would already congratulate all students who are participating in this challenge, because I think it's a unique opportunity. And I also expect that most of the students participating don't know a lot about Washington. They will learn a lot about Washington. And it is also a unique opportunity to dive into a world to really discover how things can be different. And it's also easier sometimes, because when you live in your own context, you also are blinded for things that you take for granted. So you wonder about more aspects. So for me, it's easier to do, for instance, research in Asia when I'm just new to in Asia than maybe for Tiffany, and vice versa. So you are also more wonder about everything and ask, why do people do the things they do? And I want to give a very small example, and it's a very nice example. It was about an urban greenhouse. It used to be a flower house, but then economically, roses couldn't be cultivated in the greenhouse anymore. It's here in the Netherlands, and it's a real true story. Then the owner started to begin allotment gardens in this greenhouse. And a lot of Surinamese people, because we have a large group of Surinamese people in the Netherlands, started to hire small plots for growing vegetables indoors. It was an unheated, just normal greenhouse. And then we started to ask people, so what are you doing here, and why are you growing your vegetables here? And we noticed that they mostly grew Surinamese vegetables. But it was not so much for the consumption and the production really of having enough vegetables, but it was also about, for instance, the grandparents teaching their grandchildren that these are our products, this is our culture. We chat with our neighbors, we celebrate actually Surinamese culture within this greenhouse. So it was about much more than just producing the vegetables that people crave for. Yeah. And I think that is really interesting that we wouldn't know if we wouldn't have asked and we wouldn't have dived deeper into why would they join these kind of greenhouse allotment gardening. And I think that's really relevant for the students. Just go around, ask a lot of people. And if you can't, I think that is a really important aspect of this particular greenhouse challenge. There is a batch of students available in Washington who can be the eyes, the ears, the hands of the students that participate in the challenge. And so if they have questions, if they want to know something about the local communities, I think there is a team that is coordinating the challenge is readily available to connect them to hands and ears locally.
That's great to hear. So make use of that, students here and also watching at home. It reminds me of a quote that we've been talking about before, Tiffany. A quote of Kennedy from, of course, very familiar in Washington D.C. Once said, "It's not about what your country can do for you, but also what you can do for your country." And we were talking about this, saying, well, in this case, it's also about not just about what the city can do for food production, but also what food production can mean for the city. Can you tell something? What did you mean with that?
I think the question is what the food production mean in the city, but again, also what Sabine also addressed, what can city mean for the natural environment? Because things do change very quickly. Actually, the way we know cities nowadays is not working. Take example of Beijing, where I was born. Before the 80s, around the time I was born, Beijing knows no waste. There's no plastic waste. There's no landfill. So everything you go to the market, you buy things wrapped with newspaper, are composted. So in a matter of less than half a century, what changed? Look at the mega cities in China, in everywhere, in Africa as well. That a huge amount of landfill, huge amount of plastic waste, groundwater tables dropping like crazy. So indeed, a lot of the cities currently is not contributing positively to the natural environment. We're actually only dumping or asking. So cities are asking natural environment to provide us with fresh air, with food, and we dump waste back to the environment. That's not a system that can go on forever. So it's important we ask, what does it mean cities can be, or humans also, be part of the whole ecosystem? And that's really important question, I think, for all to address.
So when they are looking into this urban area and food production as a system, what would you, does this system also have limits? Or where does the system start and where does it end?
That's a really good, important question to ask. As you mentioned, I focused my career on green buildings and planning eco-cities in China. We did a lot of studies, master planning on eco-cities. One question is always is, what is the system boundary? So when we talk about zero carbon or zero emission, what are you talking about? Is it at a building level? Should the building be zero emission or zero carbon, or should it be a community level, or just city level or country level? And that's a question I don't have a straight answer for. But as you know, where now the COP is happening in Glasgow, and the countries are really trying to get together to set targets. So let's talk about technology and talk about numbers. I think it's important now we set a boundary and to define, is the community, let's say, 25,000, and within this 25,000 people community, you need to balance your carbon credit or carbon budget. You need to be able to say, this is zero energy community, and it is zero waste. Because only when we can start doing numbers and measurements and monitor them, then we can really realistic to say, as humankind of 7 billion people, all the country will reach a target of 2050 zero carbon. And that starts from single building, single community, and up to city level and country level.
So then it's a challenge for the students to not just come with a proposal of this system, but also come with some limitations or some numbers and giving the governments the assignment to stay within that limit, maybe. Is that what you're also saying?
I think this is the third edition. I was also very honored with last year's this issue. Say, well, there's a lot of knowledge and discussion studies about sustainability, zero carbon, zero emission. The technologies are there. It's not the issue. It's the planning, the knowledge, that the desire is also there. So let's challenge to students. Let's get down to business. Show your calculation to find out exactly what are technology that can work together. What is your the embodied energy? What is your carbon balance sheet? How does it work economically? Don't expect completely 100%, but it's important to think now we need to talk about specifics.
Yep. And you touched upon the local economies when you look at some urban or some initiatives of urban agriculture at this moment. It's often running on volunteers, it's subsidized. How do you look at this, let's say, the economic feasibility of these systems, of these initiatives?
I think Sigrid has already mentioned that the project of Suriname, a lot. That's also very interesting, maybe starting from your side. How does that economics works out in that project?
Yeah, this is about allotment gardening, but there is of course a lot of actually I think there's it's already started. I don't know for sure, but in Amsterdam they're trying to build vertical farming on the distribution center of a retail chain, and actually it's a discount retail chain. So there is really looking at, can we produce fresh foods very close to the retailer who can most efficiently distribute it to consumers. So that's also about waste reduction, also during transportation, and it is for a discounter. So economically, it needs to be feasible. Otherwise, why would you do it? So these are aspects that are being developed currently. But when it gets to municipalities, for instance, when a municipality has to decide on doing urban farming in a neighborhood, also for social cohesion, then we see automatically actually that there's being talked about allotment gardening in the open air, whereas greenhouse gardening is not considered as kind of social cohesion activity of farming. So we also have in our thinking about urban planning and urban greening and urban food, we need to reconsider what is urban farming. Is it only outdoors or is it also indoors? Because we could as well say, okay, we have an empty space, but if it's open air farming only, then in the winter it's just black earth. So a lot of people don't like that, or other people want to have a playground for the children or a soccer field. So how can we then also all these competing type of functions, how can we integrate them also with food production for people? And therein we need more flexibility in thinking outdoor, indoor, vertical farming, energy dense, low energy, these kind of, we need to be more flexible, I think, in our approaches on how to actually surface all these different needs of urban citizens, food, but also other functions.
So it's not limited to indeed a rooftop garden or one vertical farm somewhere in the system. It really is about all these different functionalities. Is there something you would like to challenge there or add to that?
I think also we mentioned Sabine in her presentation, she talked about externalities, that actually we are paying not so much, of course, for poor countries, food still consume a lot of budget. For rich countries, actually, we're not paying a lot for food. A lot of big part reasons we're not paying for the externalities, the polluted water, the deforested woods, for example. So important is that urban farming, the sustainability is not only should live on subsidy or volunteers. They have also the countries now if you want to reach our zero carbon goal, we need to develop real business cases. So take example, when we look at city as the overall ecosystem service, in the countryside, our relationship with countryside will change. It means that currently farmers are growing food to sell their product to cities, let's say, and not getting too much. That's why they cannot also compensate the environment. In the future, the next years, we'll see that farming carbon, they'll become carbon farmers. So countryside will actually, farmers are paid to preserve their forest, to farm crops that can capture carbon. That will mean also the cities would have economic case producing food nearby. So that produce a whole lot of economic case for producing better hydroponic system, better vertical, urban farming facilities, monitoring devices, waste energy facilities. So this all has economic value. So we need to not to think urban farming as a niche, as a nice to have, as a feel good thing. It's something that need to be very embedded in the overall economic case.
Yeah. And really look at the positive externalities.
How do you
as
turn
well.
that into payment and to consumers' willingness to pay and communicate?
Yeah. And also on the longer term, the effects, not maybe directly measurable positive externalities, but for example, you already see it with greening cities, what the positive effect of well-being or of true living, it also has to do with the cost of living. And maybe then it suddenly comes out of budgets of the Ministry of Health because it really contributes to happy living. So is there something that triggers you maybe as a lot?
Yeah, I think two aspects that trigger me a little bit is that, first of all, people need to have, we discussed it already, and Sabine also showed it in her presentation, people need to have access to fresh food to be able to consume it. But this fresh foods need also be culturally appropriate. So for instance, in the Netherlands, we don't have food deserts like Sabine showed us in Washington. We have supermarkets everywhere and there is fresh food in every supermarket. But for a lot of people, when they don't recognize the products, especially, for instance, when people are new to a certain culture, they don't know how to cook with it, so they won't use it. And then also, when that are people with juggling their lifestyles, living under more hardship conditions, they also sometimes have multiple jobs and they don't have time to cook, they don't have time to grow, they don't have place to grow. So in urban agriculture, there's an assumption often that people like to be engaged with urban agriculture, and some people just don't like urban agriculture to do it, and people have time to engage with it, but they can't. And so I think that is all important to be aware of, that if you want to make good food available for people, it needs to be to their diet, so they will be able to cook it, and that also recognize that not everyone has the time or the willingness to participate in it. So, and I think if you develop something for a certain context, you need to be aware of to what extent people are willing and able to participate in the activities and in the consumption of those foods. I think
to really make use of these 20 students there in Washington to, let them go out there and ask people how it would fit their lifestyle. So challenge for you with the current, of course, limitation of you not all being able to go there. Such a pity. To round off, there's a question coming in from the public, so let's move up to the other side, to Maud.
Yes, thank you very much for the interesting discussion already. You're talking a lot about also the positive aspects of food production. When you're looking at urban farming right now, it's a lot of the times it's very small scale, maybe more in rich areas of cities, countries, etc. How would you is Ward 7 even like the most logical place for an urban farming thing if it's if the food is actually quite expensive, and also if it's small scale, how do you make it profitable?
Tiffany, maybe for you.
Well, I think since we're here in the Netherlands, we can also debate whether urban culture really is small scale. The Dutch has a very long tradition in indoor horticulture. Number 2 agriculture export in the world, just after US, and large part is because indoor farming. Do you call that urban farming, or is it the countries? That's okay. For the Netherlands, really urban farming. It's growing in a very 90% urbanized area. So in that sense, I think what we are talking about is that this technologies has been developing for a long time. There's different applicability for different technologies. So we need to look at as a whole system. It can be roof gardens, can be smaller community allotment plots, can be also stacked up but high-tech horticulture, so the Dutch model horizontal greenhouses, but stack them up. That's in a way that a lot of studies and pilots, prototypes are being developed. in the beginning, some art will be expensive because we need to find out what works. But eventually, this system need to become modular, cheap, and manageable. So in that sense, I think in this case, it's in the end, green and sustainable living or organic, healthy, safe food is not only for the well-off. Unfortunately, it is the case, but that needs to be changed. That's why I think this challenges is, ways to go. In the end, we can connect food hubs and prototypes around the world, so we can start changing what kind of costs, what kind of system that will work, what kind of cases that can work at different contexts.
So you're looking into not just the short term, but also the long term possibilities of.
I think we're at the beginning of only a starting point of the next revolution. Let's say it will be the next 20 years.
And you're already touching upon my last question I had to you was that what should urban agriculture really bring? And it can bring all these different kind of aspect, so that's something that the students can be exploring from all different sides. Thank you for that. Maybe a last question to Sabine, who also jumped in again virtually. A last question to you: to what would you encourage the teams to put extra attention to?
Yeah, I mean, it just came up sort of as a side note in the response. Not all of these distributed urban, what I call distributed or smaller scale systems in urban settings are high cost. Yes, some can be much lower cost, right? And so how do we scale? Typically, we've said we scale by making things bigger. But maybe the solution rests in a definition of scaling that means multiples. So this idea of modular systems where you can put one or you can put multiples. Systems that include roofs. We have a 20,000 square foot food producing roof on one of our buildings. And it's a retrofitted roof. It's on a 1972 building that definitely was not constructed with green roofs in mind. How can we use nature to lower our costs if we have ways of getting photosynthesis going rather than relying on LED lighting and a higher energy draw? Those are all things I think that we need to consider. And I would argue that actually Ward 7 is the perfect site to start to think out of the box and to redefine how we look at scaling an urban food system, because it is a challenging site.
Well, great. Well, a big challenge. I hope that you're all up for this challenge. That was my last question, but I would like to go because I just saw a glimpse of my eye that there is another question from the audience coming in. So I would like to move to Maud for the last questions to a panel.
Yes, thank you very much, Simone. We have one last question for Sabine, actually. So the people that are watching from home are wondering, the group that already visits the urban farm that you have in Ward 7, what people come to the place? Is it a homogeneous group? What are their characteristics? And also, if working on a project for the Urban Greenhouse Challenge, how could you involve the entire population in Ward 7 to be actually become more activated?
So this has been a challenging site because the university does not own this parcel of land. This parcel of land is actually owned by the Housing Authority, which is a part of a federal agency of housing and urban development. And so it has taught us a lot about the challenge of access to land in underserved neighborhoods. How do you make that possible? How can we think of access to land more longer term? So we started transforming this site, which was actually a building lot. At one time, there was a sort of a mid-rise building. I think it was 8 stories high. And then it was pulled down because it had become dilapidated. And so for many years, that site was not used at all. It was overgrown. It had big chunks of construction debris in it. And so starting in 2015, with the help of a lot of volunteers, including the DC Building Trades Association, we transformed it into what became East Capitol Urban Farm. The largest engagement from the neighborhood is in what we call the community garden portion, which consists of about 60 raised bed gardens that people in the neighborhood can have one of those gardens free of charge. And then we had a series of teaching people how to garden. We brought in seedlings from our research farm to help start basil, tomato, hot pepper production, and so forth. And over the course of 2-3 seasons, you started to see the ethnic shape of the neighborhood. There's some subsidized housing just above the site. So those folks who live there, they can easily reach that site in walking distance. So for those of you who are available on November 10th, we have a webinar scheduled with 2 of the leaders in that community, Jamel Sanders and Commissioner Antoine Holmes, who have, one is the neighborhood commissioner, what we call a sort of in the participatory governance of DC, it's the most connected to the community. And then Ms. Sanders is the president of the Deanwood Citizens Association, again, very much. So these are folks who've been actively involved in the site for a number of years now. Unfortunately, we then had to pull back some of the activities because the lease expired after an initial 3-year lease, and then came a long hiatus of negotiations of how could the lease be renewed, could it be long-term, short-term. So that story is not finished yet, but just this institution, this idea of institutions and who is involved in urban farming and urban agriculture is a really, really important conversation as well, because it speaks to some of the challenges as ownership is not necessarily predictable for these community groups. So
Thank
a lot
you,
of things to think.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for sharing this with us. It is a big challenge, and she and these 20 students in Washington, D.C. are there to support you to dive into these communities. And with that, I would like to thank Sabine for being here with us and for both of you. So a warm applause for our special guest today. So it has been wonderful to hear from you. And now we came to this final moment of today's program, which is to officially launch the Urban Greenhouse Challenge of this year, the 3rd edition indeed. So we're really moving up and going further. And for that, I'm moving to the other side of today's schedule, which is where I can welcome our Rector Magnificus Arthur Mol. Thank you very much for being here. Welcome. You made it where we first had this back-to-back meetings where we were able to just be behind the computer. You now travel through the Netherlands, but you made it. How is it to be back on campus?
Yeah, well, it's great, of course, to be back on campus and see all these students now here and be able to meet face-to-face, because that's much better than through the screen.
Yeah. Well, I was here yesterday actually in Impulse where there was dancing and music. So it was really nice during the lunch to have this activity going on again. It was just mentioned as an answer to the last question by the audience. Who is this audience going? Who are the people really going to this Ward 7 urban greenhouse, let's say, or urban agricultural area? Do you ever do something like your own farming? Do you get your food from your own garden or community garden place?
Well, I used to do when I was a student and a little bit when I was still young, but at the moment I don't do it anymore. So that's also because I'm really an urbanite, so I don't have a big garden, although, yeah, people always expect that rectors have huge houses and huge gardens, but that's not the case. Vice chancellors don't have that. But I think this is a crucial topic, of course, that we are exploring here with this urban challenge. And what I particularly like also is, of course, this is the 3rd in a row. We did it in the Netherlands the first time. The 2nd one we did in China. And this is a completely different setting. And I find the setting extremely important and really also one which is looking to the future. Because indeed, urban food growing, of course, we have experience with that. We have also a lot of experience with that for, say, the upper side, so the upper middle class or the elite if you want. But now we are going also to look in the more lower socioeconomic classes, and that's of course very exciting. And also not just how to grow food, because we know that in Wageningen. We can grow any food anywhere, with not too much water, also not too much fertilizer, etc. That's not the big problem. We do it in a real time, real space, and also with a business case and with looking at the social impact. So I think the combination of that really makes it an exciting challenge, I think.
Okay, well, great. So you say something about the real development of this, the Urban Greenhouse Challenge throughout the years, because you were really at the cradle of this first Urban Greenhouse Challenge also some years ago. When you look at this whole development, you said something on the content, but also on the professionality, let's say, of all students participating. Do you know anything about that, looking back at the results of previous years?
Well, I've always been from the first challenge onwards, I've been exciting about the results. It's amazing that, of course, we have the traditional learning setting, where we put students through a course and they learn a number of things. But this is a completely different way of learning. And what you see happening there when you put students together from different disciplines, from different nationalities even, and putting them together on a real case, so not just something from a textbook, but where they really have to look at how can you design a real thing which also has the possibility to be really also materialized in reality. That's something completely different. And if you see then what's coming out of that, it's really amazing. And what you also see is that, of course, the rector always can say this and has to say that also. But if you see what the interest is from municipalities in the outcomes, from businesses also in the outcomes, and how you see that also the number of students and the number of nationalities are growing, then I think it's not just a vice chancellor who's saying that, but it's really something, where we are getting more and more good in. And I think also the design gets better and better. Yeah. And if you now see that, what I heard is that more than 30 nationalities are already participating. It's not yet closed, so people can just enter still. And a huge amount of students. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm sure that we get outcomes of that, where what we also saw in other challenges, where people start not just see it as a study object, but also as a startup for a new company, where students continue with it, also after the finishing of such a challenge. It's amazing.
Well, so it's more than education, it's a real experience, this. Maybe a last point, what would you like to challenge all the students participating from all these different nationalities and countries joining?
Well, I think the really the exciting thing here is the social impact. So I think, so in the former challenges, it was a little bit more on the sustainability, of course, always. The business case has to be right, of course, because we want to not just do it as an ideal, typical case, but really something which we can also continue with. Here, I think what is really added is the social impact. So it is it's with and for groups of people who are not always easy in terms of having access to food. So that will be a special case to work also with lower income people, with the diversity probably of nationalities and ethnic groups. In DC also, which is it's not in the White House area, I can assure you. I've been in DC and it's really a very interesting case. So I'm really looking at new things, especially in the social impact area.
So a challenge for our students, of course, to go and do that. We're about to officially launch this year's Urban Greenhouse Challenge. But first, we're going to look at a small video before we officially launch the program.
Today, teams from all over the world are starting the social impact edition of the Urban Greenhouse Challenge. From this November until next June, they'll develop an urban farm concept that not only ensures year-round sustainable and affordable food production, but also generates incomes for the local residents. This is the toughest edition of the Urban Greenhouse Challenge so far. We'll select 20 teams for the second round based on the social impact, innovativeness, sustainability, technical feasibility and the economic viability of their first milestone report. While working on their second milestone entry, the teams will consult with coaches from our partner network of prominent companies. Several training sessions will help them enhance their visibility on social media, creating a bulletproof business model and crafting the perfect online pitch. Only the 10 best teams will make it to the finals. On June 30th, the Wageningen campus will hold an exciting event at which those 10 teams will battle for the €10,000 prize and the title of winner of the Social Impact Edition of the Urban Greenhouse Challenge. Let's start the challenge now.
Well, that seems like a super exciting challenge to me. You are welcome then on the 30th of June next year, or the 10 best teams will be welcome on campus on our new to be open building, Omnia, which is also under development still. So you're going to be one of the first few to be making use of that building. But for now, we're about to get ready, because with this press on the button, you're about to start the countdown.
All right, are we ready for that? Maybe we need some help from the audience here also.
Woo, let's
ready. Okay, let's
Yes.
start the countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4,
3, 2, 1.
Go, we started.
Woo! Well, a light show that is kind of like making us look forward just to this whole series, let's say. I think it's time to cheer with all of you here, for everybody at home, to join us in this celebration online. Stay connected, to use the chat and to look for each other, because once again, the registration is still open and there is still possibility to look for new teams to really develop this interdisciplinary team for the challenge.
Look forward to see you in Wageningen.
Thank you
Enjoy.
very much. Cheers to all of you.
Yes. Cheers.
Thank you, everybody,
Cheers.
joining us
Thank you.
online, and see you next year.
Cheers. To you too.